Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, nonpartisan look at a range of subjects that matter most to business leaders. Joining me today is Alfredo Montufar-Helu, the head of our China Center for Economics and Business at the Conference Board. And in today's conversation, we're going to discuss China's current geopolitical and economic objectives and the country's relationship with the West, and much more.
You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this series. Welcome, Alfredo.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So, Alfredo, you're in Beijing. You've lived there for a long time and you've worked. Just give us a brief background, on your experiences in China.
Well, I've been in China for almost 12 years. I'm originally from Mexico. In terms of my education, I got my bachelor's in political science and international relations from the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas. Now you can see that I speak Spanish. And my master's from Georgetown University. That's the Master of Science in Foreign Service. After I obtained my master's, I came to China. And previously, actually, I have been in China already, but I came to China in 2013, and I've been working in helping foreign multinationals navigate the Chinese market, understand the impact of policies, of economic developments and geopolitics on their operations, and also in helping Chinese multinationals capture opportunities overseas and basically go out to the foreign market.
Yeah, and so for our listeners who are in the West, all of their information about China is delivered through a filter that is Western, right? And so you are sitting there in China and you read the newspapers in the Chinese language newspapers. You have interacted with the government for, as you said, over a decade. And so you have a bit of a point of view about what's China's view of China and China's view of the West. Let's just start, though, with a little bit of history, because I think it's really important for our listeners to understand the ancient history, the long history of China, because it does color their perspective on China's current interaction with the world, right?
It is true. It is true, Steve. China is, unlike other countries, a civilization in itself that is over 1,000 years old, right? So if you look at countries such as Mexico, where I'm from, the nation-state Mexico only became established after it was colonized by Spain, and then we gained independence. So as a nation, really, China has a lot of history. Of course, we're talking about a lot of empires in China, and then the Reform era, and then how part of China were colonized by some countries. But really, when we look at China right now, we're talking about the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party, right? And so if we are trying to assess why China looks at the world as it looks at now, we really need to go back to the reform and opening era initiated by Deng Xiaoping after the tumultuous government by Mao Zedong, right? And this was an era where China opened to the world and try to leverage the comparative advantages of being more integrated to the world to the benefit of its development. And so what we have seen right now is a transition to a stronger China that is more willing to take a stance in global affairs to defend its interests and to have its say in how the global world order will impact countries and bilateral relations. And I was actually looking at how to make an interpretation of this shift. And there is before a 24-character strategy which was advanced by Deng Xiaoping. And this 24-character strategy in English is translated as observe calmly, secure our position, cope with affairs calmly, hide our capacities and bide our time, be good at maintaining a low profile, and never claim leadership. And President Xi Jinping has modified this 24-character strategy to a new one in the recently concluded National People's Congress. But I believe this was already happening of course, during his administration several years ago. And so the new 24-character strategy is, with risks and challenges increasing, be calm, keep determined, seek progress and stability, be proactive and achieve things, unite under the banner of the party, of course, and dare to fight. So there you have a shift to a more proactive strategy, to a more willingness to defend its interests in the global scene.
Yeah, and this is, against the backdrop of 1949 and everything that you've talked about that led us to today. But they also look at themselves as one of the most ancient societies on Earth, and one of the longest standing countries, a proud history, inventions of many things that have led to the modern era and so forth. And so, when they look to the West, they look at it more as an upstart, and they look at it also as the West not giving them the respect that they deserve in the world, and you can see this in how they react to a lot of things, and hence the 24 character current mantra from the government, right?
So I think, of course, given how rich Chinese history is, Chinese people feel very proud about it. And we think about how many inventions China has contributed to the world, then it's no wonder that that they feel so proud about the history. Now, if we look at how China was before, when we had the emperors, China was actually the center of its own world, right? You have in the characters 中国, 中 is actually the center, right? And when you talk about like the foreign world is 国外, what's outside the center, right? But you see, at that point, China was, of course, the center. They received tributes from many other nations, many other countries, and they considered that their emperor was appointed by heaven, right? And everyone else, even the West, actually were actually below that emperor. Now, is China trying to get back to that? That's a very interesting question, because even if we consider that they are very proud about that history, when you had the establishment of the People's Republic of China, that's kind of like breaking with the past, right? With a past that was seen as too weak to face the challenges of Western powers. You got to understand that when China was colonized by Western powers, it was seen as a failure of the dynasties of the empire to prevent this from happening. They were seen as weak. And so that in part drove the revolution that led to the establishment of the PRC.
Yeah, but this history is just so fascinating, Alfredo, because I'm afraid in the West they don't teach a lot of Chinese history, but if you listen to this, and if you listen to them thinking of themselves as the center, and I suppose that's true of any nation, wherever you sit is the center, I guess, of your own universe. But it's they want respect from the West. And so when you look at what's going on today, so much of it can be explained by just simply China trying to find that level of respect from the rest of the world, and also to get back to what they believe was their rightful place. And so hence here we are today, and you can see why they have a view that the region, it's South China Sea, the Asian region, which is around the center, is so important to them, and that intruders are really not all that welcome.
Well, I mean, you could make that interpretation, but you could also say the same of other countries that have become big regional powers, such as Brazil and Turkey, right? They all have regional interests. They all want to avoid other powers from interfering with these interests. So it's not necessarily that China wants to go back and become the center of the world, as the empire of China before, as the emperor of China understood it. It's more that they have been amongst the developing nations, amongst the emerging nations, they have been the one very successful country in becoming powerful economically, militarily, and politically in such a short frame of time. In 70 years, they have accomplished what took the United Kingdom over the best part of 200 years, right? And so right now, that, of course, breeds confidence. And looking at their history, of course, they see what Western powers did to them when they colonized China, when they, for example, forced China's hands to give them some parts of their land, like Hong Kong, for instance. and they don't want to let that happen again. So they are reacting against that history. And of course, they feel proud about what they have achieved, and they see themselves as having not only perhaps the right, but also the power to be able to defend those interests.
Yeah. So, okay, so then you go back to the West and you look at things and the fear is that China is allying with Russia against the West. I mean, that's sort of the Western view. And maybe that they're gearing up for an invasion of Taiwan, with the bases, they're spying on nations, they're stealing IP, yada, yada, yada. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that the West is now looking at. But what is China's view of all of that? What are their objectives?
Let me first talk about for China, Russia. In an environment where Western economies, which are the largest economies in the world, except for China and India, for instance, but the most developed ones, in an environment where they have grown increasingly antagonistic to China and to the Communist Party, there are just no incentives for China to deny its partners like Russia. Actually, on the contrary, this environment is pushing China and Russia closer. So that's how also they see this, right? In looking at this geopolitical environment from their perspective, why would they deny this partnership? Why would they do this while at the same time Western governments are taking actions against them? So in the eyes of the Chinese authorities, this is justified. This is not to say that they want to break with the global order. I don't believe they want, or that they want to have a conflict, an armed conflict. It's not in their benefit to have that. Now, talking about Taiwan, there is no question that reunification with Taiwan is one of their main goals. There have been some reports about what this means in reality and whether the Chinese military is preparing for doing that in the next 5 years or in the next 10 years. I think it's not clear whether China is really going to go ahead and do this and have a war over Taiwan, because it is just, again, not in their best interest to do so. From a military perspective, I don't think I think that what happened in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, shows that whatever calculations the Chinese military had with respect to what it would look like if they invaded Taiwan, well, those calculations changed. Economically, I think that what the Western businesses have done to boycott the Russian economy also shows some of the consequences that would fall on China if they were to do this, right? I think, from their perspective, from the China perspective, what they're doing right now, for example, in proposing this peace proposal between Russia and Ukraine, in trying to reunify with Taiwan, they're just doing what's best in their own interest, geopolitically speaking, as a power that is able to defend its interests. And that's it. I mean, pragmatically speaking, realistically speaking, this is no different from what other big powers would do.
Yeah. Well, and China takes a long view on everything. They do 100-year plans where everybody else is trying to figure out what to do next month. And pretty much they execute them. So, if you look at the long view, and they are very good students of history. So as you look at history, these regional wars, or even, the larger world conflicts, I mean, nobody wins in any of these. And you can get bogged down. China realizes that, and they don't want to be part of that as well. However, there still is this tension with the West. And so then, my question is, what is China's view of the West? So they're sitting there, trying to interpret, all of these Western nations who kind of act together and similarly, but they really are different. So just kind of run us through how they view the West.
Well, of course, I think that they realize that each Western country is different. It has its own characteristics in terms of culture, in terms of society, in terms of the economy, and in terms of the political system. There's just no question about it. How they see the U.S., they see it as a hegemon that it's trying to contain them and contain their rise. They have declared as much. How they see the European countries, they see them as countries that in one way or another have been unable to do or to pursue strategic autonomy vis-a-vis their relationship with the world, and vis-a-vis what the U.S. is doing, right? So basically following the U.S.'s lead with NATO and with other policies. So I think the question is, are they seeing the West as one bloc that is trying to contain China's rise? No, they're not. I mean, they're more subtle about this. They're more sophisticated. And what the real concern is what the U.S. will do next to contain them in areas such as technology, in areas such as military, in areas such as trying to rally all the allies to present a common front against China.
Yeah, very interesting. So, as you look at it sitting in Beijing, what areas do you see the West and China having agreement?
Right. So I think that the clearest area is, environmental transition, the green transition, environmental sustainability, addressing climate risks, because that's the one area where I think, every country is in agreement that if we don't do something now, we're going to have a very, very, very dangerous risk in the future of things going really wrong with the world. Other areas that I think they're in agreement, but they don't agree on how to go about it, is the necessity to reform global institutions. I think that's an agreement. Everyone is trying to reform global institutions. You name it, the Bretton Woods institutions, the UN, WTO, World Bank, IMF, all of them want to reform them. How they want to reform them, that's a different question. Because China, of course, is looking for its own interest, and the US is looking for its own interest, and Europeans are looking for their own interests, right? So I guess another area of agreement is alleviation of poverty. That's one of the big slogans of China. And another one is healthcare, in terms of medicine, of providing medicines to the less fortunate in the world. And those would be the key areas of agreement, I would say.
Okay, so flip it around, and where are the key areas of disagreement between China and the West?
I think one of the biggest areas of disagreement is the use of technology, right? Dual-use technologies, how China perceives how technologies should be used. And of course, the US does not agree with this type of conception. Europeans also don't agree with this. Another area of disagreement is how China subsidizes some of its overseas investments, which of course is not in alignment with the market economies in Western nations. Another area of disagreement would be how China considers, let's call it, its surrounding areas as part of its own area of hegemony, right? And of course, here we're talking about, there is a lot of territorial disputes in the South China Sea. And it's not only China that is claiming these islands, it's everyone in South China Sea is claiming these islands. But these are so important because this is a region where over half of trade passes through, right? So whoever controls these waters is going to be in a very significant strategic position over everyone else. That's why it's so significant. And of course, that's why the US and European powers are not happy with having one single power controlling these waters.
Yeah, and to some extent, you hear it in not directly from President Xi, but from many of the ministers who say, look, we don't have the Chinese Navy parked in the Gulf of Mexico, and yet you have the U.S. Navy sitting in the South China Sea, and it feels threatening. So this is why I think it's important to look at the point of view from both directions in order to understand, why people are doing and why nations are doing what they're doing. Now, you talked about China's influence outside of China, and one of the key ways that they have been doing that for some time now, and you and I have talked about this in previous podcasts, is China's Belt and Road Initiative, and now we have, as you introduced, the 2.0 initiative. Much of this is to secure natural resources around the world, initially in Africa, but now increasingly in South America. Talk about their objectives here. Is it resources only, or is it also geopolitical, or are there other objectives?
I think the initiative in itself has lowered its profile. It has come back this year, though. I mean, we just heard from the government that there will be the next Belt and Road International Cooperation Forum this year. So it's coming back, but it's still much more lower profile than it was before, right? Much more lower profile. In terms of which investments are being undertaken under this initiative, of course, you have many of them targeting the acquisition of raw materials, of commodities that are important for emerging technologies. You're talking about cobalt, you're talking about copper, but you also have other acquisitions more on the infrastructure side, the building of railroads, of course, the acquisition of existing ports, for example, all of them which are going to help at some point also drive trade from China with these countries. Now, on the geopolitical side, as I said last time in our previous podcast on BRI 2.0, Steve, it would be naive to think that China has no geopolitical ambitions as it undertakes this initiative, right? It would be naive to think that it doesn't have any ambitions, as it would have been naive to think that China didn't have any, that the US didn't have any ambitions with the Marshall Plan. I mean, it's same thing. These types of initiatives, in a way, they have the economic, drivers, but there is also a geopolitical driver, and that's how we need to understand them.
Yeah, and they're both intertwined, and you can't divorce one from the other. Now, you look at China, and the size of the nation, population, et cetera. They are a huge force. I mean, they have the largest population of any country in the world. India is close behind, but they're the largest. They have a huge land mass. They are not the largest land mass nation, but they are a huge land mass, and certainly huge shoreline and so forth. They've got great resources, intellectual resources, natural resources. And so, they're sitting here as the number 2 economy in the world, and it's just inevitable that as they go from, and their GDP per capita rises, it's inevitable that with that many people, 1.4 billion people, versus, for instance, the US with 325 million people, it's inevitable that they will be number 1 in economic terms in the world. When do you predict this will occur? But then more importantly, what are the ramifications? I mean, do you just keep going and it doesn't matter, or do they leverage that in a different way than they are today?
That is a very interesting question, Steve, because there is a certainty here, and that is that China will become the number 1 economy in the world. That's a certainty. And according to some forecasts, this will happen in 2030, 2031, 2032, if you take into account the impact of COVID, for example. That said, if we're talking about GDP per capita, China is still far below every other advanced economy. So we also need to consider that. But it's a certainty that China is going to become the largest economy in the world. Now, what it's uncertain is what are the ramifications. But when we think about when these ramifications will happen, let's go back then to the question of whether China, after it becomes the largest economy, will stop putting or emphasis or focusing on the domestic economy, because again, they're worried about GDP per capita levels, about common prosperity. So that's one thing. Now, if we assume that China is able to push forward common prosperity and to have a reasonably high GDP per capita, will China behave like a hegemon? And as a hegemon, try to export its model to other countries, or try to break up the international system and just implement its own ideas or its own view of about how the world should be ruled? And I think that China actually likes global institutions because it has brought order, it brings stability to the system, and what it wants is to reform them, of course, in a way that reflects its own interests and its own pursuit of principles. And we have heard as much in terms of, for example, the China and Russia, President Putin and President Xi Jinping just met, and they released actually a communique where they defend the UN system. Of course, it's kind of funny how they defend it, or what the communique says. but about defending the UN institutions. But China, I think, it still likes to have that system because it brings stability, it brings order. And I think that when you think about why China's model of government, or actually China as a hegemon, is attractive for other countries, it's precisely because there is nothing as China exceptionalism, for example, which is one of the main criticisms from countries in Africa, countries in Latin America vis-a-vis the US. It's about the US exceptionalism and so on and so forth. So far, China is not doing this. Which then, of course, leads to the potential of, rather than having another hegemon, rather than having that, is actually having China, yes, as a global power, but a global power that is tolerant of other regional powers with their own sphere of influence and with their own interests.
Yeah, and your point is that they like to work through institutions. So you could imagine that maybe they would leverage the UN more than in the past as a leader, or the World Trade Organization, which that's a whole separate issue. But I guess that the last question here as we wrap up is, okay, as they become number one within the next decade, almost certainly, as you say, is the West in any further danger than, let's say, they are today? I mean, does this create a dangerous situation? Does China then say we now have power to launch kinetic activity against the West? So where does it go?
From an international relations realist perspective, no. And the simple reason is that not only China has nuclear weapons, and so that deterrence just puts a stop on any kind of ambition to control the world as they see fit. Simple as that. From an influential perspective, yeah, China will have then more influence on other countries. But again, China being the largest economy doesn't mean that China has the strongest GDP per capita or the strongest technologies. And this is something that Western economies, even though China will be the largest economy, Western economies will still have an advantage over China. So it's not automatic that China will be able to dictate how the world has to function. So it's not going to be an automatic there. And I think that as China continues growing and, again, becomes number one economy in the world, Western nations, what would be dangerous is to see this transition into the largest economy as an existential threat to them. Because if they see this as an existential threat, then they're themselves going to take actions that are going to escalate the potential of a conflict between China and them. And so that is the risk. It is not that China itself is going to present a risk, but the belief that China rising is an existential risk to the West, that's what creates the risk.
Well, because the West takes action to defend or to deter that. And maybe that's because they've seen it happen so many times, but not from China. So this is the case. And this is why, Alfredo, it's so important for people to take a view as China views itself and as China views others, because it doesn't necessarily look like the same thing that the West views, China and others through the same lens, and hence the importance of this conversation today.
Indeed, Steve. And I think that this is the one thing that we need to continue having. I mean, the ability to discuss, to bridge these understanding gaps, to address miscommunication. And this is something that the world is lacking right now. But I hope that we can address that lack. And if not, then I myself personally things are not gonna improve if we don't have communication. So very thankful to have been invited today to provide my thoughts on this.
Yeah, great and great comments, Alfredo. It's very helpful to listen to, the views from China.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for listening into CEO Perspectives. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues, with your friends, with your geopolitical friends around the world. I know they're going to want to listen. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.